What I wanted to talk about tonight for my mom, so this is the second time I've gotten the opportunity to do this, second time I'm doing this. And it means a lot to me, to my family, to have the opportunity to do something for memorializing for my mom, give an opportunity to share a little bit about her and to tie it to Torah, to what I invest my life in, my career. And I really appreciate all of you being here, giving me the opportunity for this. So thank you everybody for coming. What I want to talk about tonight is a discussion in the Gemara that feels particularly relevant and important to me, because as those who know my mom know, and those who've heard me talk about her, my mom really had two totally different careers in her life. One was as a teacher. She spent decades teaching between ages kindergarten to through college even. Fun fact, my mom was my kindergarten teacher and my 8th grade teacher. So, yeshiva day school works like that sometimes. So my mom had a large educational background, a lot of experience in pedagogy, and she also was a chocolatier. So the chocolatier part, maybe you'll see a little bit more on Shabbos, those who make it to Kiddush. Going to host the Kiddush on the day of the Yahrzeit itself for my mom. We'll have some chocolates and various things that remind me of the food my mom made. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about my mom as the educator, my mom as a teacher, my kindergarten teacher, my 8th grade teacher. My mom's email was Mora JN1 because her persona as a Mora, as a teacher in a Jewish day school, is so fundamental. And I want to talk about a surprising sugya, a surprising Gemara that seems to lay out a restriction against teaching Torah on Shabbos. So thank you everybody for joining. I see more people are joining. Feel free to keep joining. We're going to start now with source 1 here. I'm just going to pull out my little pointer. Perfect. So the first source here is a very surprising Gemara. The Gemara is talking about why is it that you can't teach children Torah on Shabbos. The Gemara says schools should close down and children should not learn new things on Shabbos. So the Gemara discusses, and it says, and the Gemara Nedarim here, 37b, Gabe Shabbos, Hainu Taima de Ein Koran B'Tchila. The reason on Shabbos you're not allowed to teach a kid something new, Mishum de Yifnu Avasun de Yanuki L'Mitzvasa de Shabbos. Because the fathers of the children need free time for the mitzvah of Shabbos. So we'll put aside the gendering of fathers. We know women are equally obligated, equally commanded in the mitzvah of Shabbos. Perhaps the assumption is that the fathers are the ones who are teaching Torah. Nowadays, that's not always the case, but nonetheless, the parents will be preoccupied with the mitzvah of Shabbos, and therefore, they shouldn't busy themselves teaching their children new things. You can do chazara, you can review things that you've learned already, but school should close down and parents shouldn't teach new material on Shabbat. The Ibai Sema, if you want, you can say a second option. Mashim de b'shabasa achlin v'shasin. On Shabbos, the children will be eating and drinking so much. The yakir alehan alma, and they'll end up feeling sluggish. Kedam Shmuel shinoi veset tchiat choli me'ayim. As Shmuel said, when you change your diet, when you change your general day-to-day routine, it leads to sickness. It leads to some amount of sluggishness. So the Gemara presents two reasons for a rule that it takes as obvious, a rule that it takes as halacha. That rule is you cannot teach students new material on Shabbat, not even Torah, specifically here talking about Torah. And it gives two reasons. The first reason offered is because on Shabbos, the parents need to be involved in the mitzvah of Shabbos. The second answer is because the kids eating and drinking Sudat Shabbos, being busy and consuming all this food, as we all know we do on Shabbos, they'll be so tired and so sluggish, they won't have attention to learn. So just to point out, these two separate answers, these two options given in the Gemara, present very different theories or very different focuses on why it should be that we don't teach children on Shabbos. The first answer, that the parents need time for Shabbos, is Shabbos oriented. The point is that Shabbat has certain requirements, and there's a conflict inherent between Shabbat and between teaching students new material. Between teaching and Shabbat, those come into attention together. Whereas the second answer is not specific to Shabbat in any way. It could be any day that a student eats too much, or that there's a birthday party, or that there's some sort of shinoi veset, a change in routine, a change in schedule. Then the student won't be able to learn, they won't be able to pay attention. In other words, whereas the first answer given in the Gemara seems to be a law in the Hilchot Shabbos and the laws of how to properly observe Shabbat, the second answer given in the Gemara is more of a law of Hilchot Talmud Torah. It's a law of pedagogy. What is a good idea, a good way to efficiently teach students? And given that question, ultimately the answer is, it's not a good idea to teach students on Shabbat because they'll be a little bit sluggish. So the Gemara's two answers, they're not just random two different possibilities, but they're two opposing theories as to why is it that we don't teach students on Shabbat. The first answer seems to say, well, that's a law on Shabbat. The second answer seems to say, well, that's a law in teaching students. It's not effective pedagogy to teach students when they have such a busy day. So if that's the two options presented in the Gemara, those are the theoretical legal possibilities. When we look in Rambam, when we look at the halachic codification, we see what it gets translated to practically in halacha, in Jewish law. So in source 2, we see that Rambam says, Lo yibatli hutinokot klal, the schools and children should never stop learning, chutz me'arvei Shabbatot, except for Erev Shabbos, the Yamim Tovim, and holidays. B'sof hayamim, v'yamim tovim, v'yamim tovim b'sof hayamim, v'yamim tovim. Fine. So on holidays, on Sabbath, on Erev holidays and Sabbath. Aval b'Shabbat, on Shabbat itself, in Koren b'Tchila, we don't teach students new material. Aval shonin barishon, but they can go and review, they can go back on things that they've already learned. So very interesting, Adine is raising in the chat the possibility of an ambiguity. Is the concern about the parents or about the children? That's actually ambiguous in the Gemara, and the various Rishonim, some of which we'll see, discuss a little bit. Is the concern that the children will be sluggish or that the parents will be sluggish? Is the concern that the children will be involved in Mitzvah Shabbos or that the parents will be involved in Mitzvah Shabbos? So it's a little bit ambiguous. Thank you for raising that. But so what we see now is that the Rambam says on Shabbos you can't teach new material. You can only do chazara of old material. But what Rambam doesn't say, Rambam doesn't give a reason. Rambam doesn't tell us if he's motivated by the first reason, Allah and Hilchot Shabbat, that you need free time for Shabbos for the proper celebration of Shabbos, or whether he's basing it on the second reason, that it's because the children will be sluggish or the parents might be sluggish. There'll be some amount of change in routine, and that will lead to inopportune, inefficient pedagogy. So, but what we do have is a small clue in the Rambam. Because when we look in the Rambam, where does the Rambam codify, where does the Rambam bring this halacha? Hilchot Talmud Torah. Rambam doesn't bring this in his laws of how to observe Shabbat, the various requirements of observance on Sabbath. Rather, Rambam brings this in his laws of how to teach and learn Torah. So already that sort of pushes us in the direction of thinking that Rambam is holding like the later position, that the problem here is that it's bad pedagogy. The kids aren't going to pay attention if it's Shabbos. So just to draw this out, the Mishnah Yaakov, Rav Yaakov Nissen Rosenthal, he was the Rosh Yeshiva, Yeshivat Hagra. He actually passed away, I think, in 2010, but he's a recent Rosh Yeshiva, contemporary. He says as follows, pointing out a similar sensitivity to the codification of the Rambam. So in source 3, he says as follows, Hine Gemara. In the Gemara it says, Shnei Tamim, 2 reasons why we don't teach children on Shabbat. Echad, 1 reason why we don't teach children on Shabbat, for those joining now, we're going over the sugya, the discussion about whether or not you can teach children new material, new Torah on Shabbos. The Gemara seems to say it's prohibited and gives different reasons. So there's 2 reasons in the Gemara why we don't teach people new material on Shabbat. Echad, the first reason, because the parents of the children need free time for Shabbos. If you want, you could say, or because the kids will be eating and drinking a lot and they'll get sluggish. According to the first reason, so Rabbi Yaakov Rosenthal, Nissen Rosenthal here, he says exactly what we said. The first reason is clearly a lot about Shabbat. The concern is that you need free time to observe Shabbat, and you won't have that if you have to busy yourself with teaching new material. But the second reason, that's a law of pedagogy. That's a law of how to efficiently teach. That's a law of Hilchot Talmud Torah. That since they're eating and drinking so much on Shabbos, they won't be able to learn something new, which requires a lot more effort. And says the Mishnah Yaakov, the exact same diak, the same point that we made. The fact that Rambam codifies this in the laws of Talmud Torah, in the laws of how to teach and learn Torah, indicates Rambam must be holding like the second position. The concern is the sluggishness of the children. Below B'Hilchos Shabbat, he doesn't bring it in the laws of observing Shabbat. So Rambam must hold like the later position. And Rambam, as is his way, is holding like the later explanation in the Gemara, that what we're dealing with here is a law in the laws of Talmud Torah and pedagogy. So before we go on, I just want to ask, does this make sense to everybody? Does everybody understand? Are there any questions? We're dealing with a law that you're not allowed to teach new material to students on Shabbos. Schools should close on Shabbat. And we have two possible explanations. One is a law on Shabbat, that it's somehow inappropriate to teach on Shabbos because you need free time. The second is not a law on Shabbat, but rather seems to be a law on Talmud Torah, that it's inefficient to teach students when they're sluggish from all the food and drink they consume over Shabbos. We just said Rambam seems to indicate like the latter. Great. So now carrying on, the Mishnah Yaakov points out that while Rambam may hold that way, it's not so clear that other halachic decisors agree. The Torah, a later codifier of the halacha, he writes in Siman Reish Mem Hey, Behilchot Melamdim, Seif Yadaled, Ein koren letinokos b'Shabbos. We don't teach children things mitchila that are new on Shabbos. Ma shelo lamdu, which they haven't yet learned. Mishum toreach Shabbos, because it's a tircha, it's an inconvenience on Shabbos. In other words, says the Torah, that the concern is a Shabbat concern. It's that there's a tircha, it somehow detracts from the celebration of Shabbos. That seems to imply that what we're dealing with here is a law in the laws of Shabbos and not a law in the laws of Talmud Torah and how to teach Torah efficiently. Because the Torah himself writes the concern is that there's tircha on Shabbos, there's a busyness with Shabbos, the kasha, and it's difficult. That's difficult because we know that the Torah brings us halacha in Hilchot Melamdim. He brings us in the part of the law that's dedicated to teaching Torah, not in the part of the law dedicated to how to observe Shabbat. But kasha came to my lo haviyu dat Hilchot Shabbat. Why doesn't he mention this in Hilchot Shabbat? The Kenizkar, like we mentioned above. Vim ki al Torah Shulchan Aruch lo kasha. So says the Mishnah Yaakov, this isn't actually a difficulty for the Torah. Why? De'ein darkam lahaviyat halachot lefi musagehem. This is an important foundational methodological point. Says the Mishnah Yaakov, the Torah and after him the Shulchan Aruch do not necessarily organize their halachot conceptually. They don't necessarily think, oh, well, conceptually, what section does this law fit the most into? They don't do that. Rather, ela lefi inyanim. They do it just based off of a loose characterization of what is the inyan, what is the matter that's most directly relevant. So while you're teaching Torah, you have to know how to teach Torah. Now, why can't you teach Torah on Shabbat? Well, that's for Shabbos reasons. That's a din in Hilchot Shabbos. The conceptual force behind it, the reasoning behind it, is based on the laws of how to observe the Sabbath. But nonetheless, it only comes up when you're teaching Torah. So therefore, it makes sense the Torah would include it within the laws of teaching Torah. Aval mehar Rambam. But when it comes to the Rambam's codification, maybe Tamid halachot lefi musag. There's an assumption that Rambam always organizes his halachot conceptually. And this is something we've touched upon a few times in our shiurim together, that Rambam is really dedicated to the conceptual, intentional organization of his book. We know through various manuscripts the Rambam will cross out individual words, move sections around, that it's an intentional and very purposeful organization. What's being called here conceptual, based off the musagim. So if Rambam puts this law on the laws of Talmud Torah, it must be that Rambam thinks that this is a law in Hilchot Talmud Torah. For the Torah, though, it's fine. The Torah just thinks that this is a law in Hilchot Shabbat. But what we arrive at from there is that we have a machloket, we have a disagreement between the Torah and the Rambam. The Torah seems to hold, like the first explanation in the Gemara, that the concern is having enough free time on Shabbat, whereas the Rambam seems to hold, like the second answer, that what we're dealing with here is a practical consideration of pedagogical best practices, that it's hard to teach new material when the kids are eating and drinking and sluggish on Shabbat. So we see we have presumably an unresolved machloket between the two of them. So what is this machloket? What are the stakes of this question? Why would one agree or disagree? What is the significance of these positions? So before we go into that, I want to point out that there is an approach, there is a tradition that minimizes the machloket, that minimizes the disagreement between these two opinions. So for example, you see that the Aruch HaShulchan, perhaps influenced, perhaps motivated by the desire to make the Rambam and the Torah agree, to minimize the disagreement, he interprets the Gemara slightly differently than the Pshat, slightly differently than the obvious explanation, and he says as follows. Isa ben Adarim de'ein kor l'tinokas b'Shabbos davar chadash. The Gemara in Adarim teaches you can't teach children new things on Shabbos, mashal lo lamdu adayin, which they haven't learned already. Shekasha lahem lehaven mipnei toreach Shabbos. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, It's not that when the Torah says there's a concern of tircha on Shabbos, of Toreach Shabbos, he means that you're not going to be able to properly observe Shabbat. Exactly the opposite. What he means is that Shabbos is so distracting, the kids won't be able to learn properly. So it's still a law in Hilchot Talmud Torah. It's still a law in proper pedagogy. The point is that Shabbos itself is so full of excitement and a change in schedule that you won't really be able to learn properly. So essentially, both the Rambam and the Torah would end up siding on the same side that what we're dealing with here is a law in pedagogy, a law in best practices of how to teach Torah. And therefore, since it's inefficient, it's difficult to compete either with the celebration of Shabbat, or maybe more mundanely, more physically, with the sluggishness that comes with eating delicious, oily Shabbos food. Therefore, we don't teach kids on Shabbos. The machloket ends up being very, very small. Just to take this one step further, there's actually an early tradition, quoted here in the Shita Mekuvetzet in the name of the Ritzkias, the Rabbi Isaac from Giyot, 11th century Spain, a very early tradition, which says that really the two answers in the Gemara aren't really so different. Because the Ritz Giyot has a different gears than the Gemara. You look here, it says, Yesh nuschot the Garsi, le'meitzata lahon. So going back to the Gemara. We saw the first answer in the Gemara is we don't teach new material on Shabbos. Why? The Yavnu avasun de Yanuke, because the parents of children need free time. Why? Lemitzvasa de Shabbasa, for the mitzvah of Shabbos. But there's another gear, so there's another text that says Lemeitzasa de Shabbos, for the mitzvah, for the findings of Shabbos, for the investigations in Shabbos. And the Ritzkias explains what's that mean? That he says, De'ein kora tinoka b'tchila parsha lefnei Rabban, elashonin lefnei Rabban ofnei avian masha kara b'shvua. They repeat things, they only do repetition, they don't learn something new. Why? Mipnei she'avian shalhan mufanim b'Shabbos, lishmoa masha karu b'chol, leidam yodam atol barar. Because Shabbos is the time where parents are free to go over the past week's lessons and make sure that their children actually understand what they learned this week. So Parsha questions, the earliest source perhaps we have for Parsha questions. What did you learn in school this week? What did you learn in yeshiva this week? The Ritzkias. The Ritzkias here says you should not be teaching new material on Shabbos because Shabbos should be dedicated to doing chazara, to reviewing material. But again, what that's not saying is that there's any problem in Shabbos itself. It's merely a practical point, again, a pedagogical point. If you need to review, and the only time you're free for review is Shabbat, then you should be reviewing on Shabbat and not learning new material, or you'll never review. So what we see so far is that clearly one way to understand why there's a prohibition, why there's a rabbinic injunction against teaching new Torah on Shabbat, is because it's bad pedagogy. It's a bad method to teach, either because the students won't be paying attention, or because you should be using that time to review. That's a dedicated review time. But nonetheless, while the Ritz Giyas has this different girsa, and while we have this reinterpretation of the Gemara based on it, it seems that the majoritarian approach, the obvious pshat in how to understand this Gemara, is that this is in fact, the first answer is in fact an answer that has to do with the laws of Sabbath observance itself. It's not a suggestion that you should do review. It's not just a suggestion of how to best do pedagogy. But rather, the first answer really is about how to observe Shabbat. So before we go on to explore that, just want to make sure, does everybody understand what we've seen so far? The Gemara presents two answers for why it is that we don't learn new material. We don't teach students new material on Shabbat. One of them seems to be Shabbat oriented, that somehow it violates the celebration of Shabbat. The second answer seems to be more practical, more pedagogically oriented, that the students won't learn well. And we saw that some people try to bridge those two answers and really minimize the difference between the two of them. So far, so good? Excellent. So now, to explore a little bit more, flesh out this first approach. There's something, not just a practical advice, not just a pedagogical concern, but there's something actually wrong with your observance of Shabbat if you're teaching students on Shabbat. So just to explore that through the earlier sources, when we look at Rashi, we see how Rashi explains that, and ultimately Rashi's explanation becomes the approach of the Ashkenazi Rishonim, of the French Rishonim, of the majority of French followers of Rashi. So Rashi says, the Yavnu avasun de Yanuke le'mitzvah yohon. The first answer that there's some sort of violation of Shabbat because parents need that time. She'im hayu asukin l'hakrotan betchila. If the parents are busy involving themselves in teaching something new, b'davar chadash, hayateruden behen. They're going to be very busy and preoccupied with it. V'lo hayu pnuin the mitzvah Shabbos. They won't have free time for the mitzvah of Shabbat. L'hitaning bo, to celebrate it. Aval shonin, but they'll be teaching. Aval shonin, but you can review. because they've already learned it once and it won't take as much time. In other words, says Rashi, what we have here is a pragmatic concern for the celebration of Shabbat. Shabbat takes time to celebrate, and if you're dedicating your time to teaching students, you won't have time to properly celebrate Shabbat. So it's still a pragmatic concern. The concern is that you're using your time up where it should have been used for something else. But the pragmatism here is Shabbat oriented. You're not going to properly celebrate Shabbos if you're using your time teaching students new material. So we see from Rashi a slightly different approach now. What he says is this really is a din in Hilchot Shabbat. It's a law in the proper observances of Shabbat. But it's a pragmatic one. We need that time for Shabbos observance. What Rashi leaves out is what Shabbos observance do you need more time for? It's not that big of a deal, but Shabbos is long, especially nowadays. Shabbos ends late. What is it that I need my time for on Shabbat? So we have to look to Tosfos, and Tosfos spells it out. Even when you're dealing with parents who are teaching for free, and therefore you don't have to worry about the complicated laws of paying the teacher on Shabbat, they need free time. They need free time to eat their meal on Shabbos. And if they have to teach something new, they'd be so busy teaching their students, they won't have time to eat their meal. So we see a very interesting idea. I guess maybe meals took longer or lessons took longer back then, that there would be no way you could properly teach and enjoy your Shabbos meal. So to prevent you from being concerned about getting both of those things done, you should only have your Shabbos meal and not teach. So again, what we see is that, just to drive it home, the Meiri spells it out even more. The Meiri says, parents will be concerned and pay attention to their students, to their children's learning, the Kriya Rishona, especially when they're learning something new. And they'll go to help them. And they'll give up their time and forgo eating a proper Suda on Shabbos. In the morning, they'll forgo their morning meal. In the Erev, the Suda Mincha. In the evening, they'll forgo Suda Shishit. Because you have to observe you have to eat 3 meals on Shabbat. And we're concerned you might miss one if you have to teach your students new material. So again, we see very clearly a practical concern that you need to have enough free time to fulfill the mitzvah on Shabbos. And this will take up free time. This will prevent you from fulfilling Shabbat in another way. So now to take a step back, what we've seen are 2 possible reasons why we don't teach students in Shabbat. One is a pragmatic concern in pedagogy. It won't be an effective way to teach. The other is a pragmatic concern in Hilchot Shabbat. It won't be an effective way to observe Shabbos. You won't have time to do what you need to do. So far, so good. Does that make sense? Everyone understand the difference? Awesome. I'm seeing some head nods, so I'm going to pretend everyone understands. But what I want to suggest, or not even me, I want to illustrate, there's actually a different approach that's very challenging and a little bit radical. And that approach says that it's not just a pragmatic concern. It's not just a question of resource allocation. If I'm using my time for this, I won't be able to use it for Shabbos. But rather, intrinsically, the act of teaching new material on Shabbat violates Shabbos. It is an expression of Chilul Shabbos, an expression of violating Shabbos. That somehow by teaching new material, we are directly in conflict with the laws of observing of Shimur Shabbos. So to give one example, in the Shut Minchas Elazar, the responsive of Tzvi Shapira in 20th century Hungary, he has a long shuba where he quotes from here, you see, Re'isi b'shut Sapichas b'Davash, a Sfaradi. He quotes the Sephardic authority, that's Sapichat b'Davash, which was a pain to track down, but I checked, he really does say this. The Sapichat b'Davash, who says, She'oser limot ha'iyun b'Shabbos, mipnei she'megia et atzmo u'moneh me'oneg Shabbos. Based off of our Gemara, he concludes, it's forbidden to learn in depth on Shabbat. Because the very act of learning something difficult is itself a violation of the rest of Shabbos. And therefore he concludes, and some authorities after him, that you can't learn Gemara B'Iyan. You can't learn in depth. You can't learn the difficult parts of Torah. You can only learn the easy, chill parts of Torah on Shabbos, lest you become too preoccupied with the difficulty of Torah, breaking your head over the Gemara, and you don't enjoy your Shabbos day. In other words, this approach, based on the Minchas Elazar here, and we're going to soon see Rav Yaakov Emden also quotes it, this approach by later halakhic authorities views the first answer of the Gemara not as another pragmatic concern of, well, you're using your time for learning and you should be using it for Shabbos, but rather as a direct violation of Shabbat. learning difficult material is not restful, and that violates Shabbos. A shocking idea. Shocking for numerous reasons. One, we know that many of us enjoy learning Torah on Shabbos, and the Gemara has a number of statements and midrashim that indicate, that say that Shabbos is a Zman Torah, Zman Talmud Torah. Yerushalmi says Shabbos, much like Yom Tov, is a day that's half for Torah, half for eating and drinking. So what do you mean you can't learn things in depth on Shabbos? But beyond that, who ever heard of this? Well, we're inventing this idea in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. What is the source for this idea that you can't learn new Torah on Shabbos? So to try and arrive at an earlier source, and some sort of support for our Gemara, we see that Rav Yaakov Emden, in his Siddur Ya'avatz, in his collection of halachot, he also, quoting our Gemara and then quoting another Gemara, reaches a similar conclusion. Rav Yaakov Emden gives a little bit more sourcing, a little bit more background to it. So Rav Yaakov Emden goes even further, and he says not only is it that you can't learn on Shabbos because it's problematic, we see that, for example, even the Minchas Salazar still says the fundamental problem is monea ma'oneg Shabbos. The difficulty of learning prevents you from enjoying Shabbos. Rav Yaakov Emden goes one step further. He says, Lo yadr atzmo b'limud haGemara ba'omek. You should not burden yourself with deep learning of Gemara. Why? Shegam ze nechshav chilul Shabbos. He goes the full 9 yards. He says learning Iyun, learning in-depth Torah on Shabbos is chilul Shabbos. It's desecration of Shabbos. An unbelievable idea. We have a fundamental clash. You can't learn on Shabbos because you're mechalal it. The Gemara Aruchahi, and he quotes a Gemara that he brings as a support. So perhaps this is our support for the idea that learning Torah on Shabbos is itself a fundamental contradiction, a fundamental stira to Hilchot Shabbos. So what is the Gemara? It's the Gemara in Shabbos, Kuf Yotet Amud Bet. And the Gemara in Kuf Yotet Amud Bet says as follows. Rabbi Zera Mahader Azuze Zuze de Rabbanan. Rabbi Zera used to go around looking for pairs or couples of rabbis, in other words, chavrusas, people who are learning together. Amar lahu, he would say to them, B'matuta minaychu lo techalulune. Please don't desecrate the Shabbos. And we see very clearly here the language used, techalulune, chilul. Rabbi Zera's concern is about violating Shabbos. So now, of course, this Gemara is very ambiguous what it means. And okay, Rabbi Zera would go around to tell couples of people don't break Shabbos. Maybe he was reminding them of Shabbos. Maybe they were talking about sports and he was saying don't look up the sports scores on Shabbos. All it tells us that Rabbi Zera would find couples of rabbis and tell them don't break Shabbos. But we see that, for example, Rashi explains a little bit. And Rashi says as follows. Kishaya roa otan zugot zugot. When Rabbi Zera would see people talking in pairs, umedabrin b'Torah, and talking about Torah, mechazar achreim, he'd follow after them. V'omer lahem, and he'd say to them, v'metuta minachon lechu, v'dazku ba'oneg Shabbos. Please go and engage in celebrating Shabbos, v'lo tichalulunu levatlam tanugim. And don't desecrate it by nullifying, by neglecting the celebration. So just to point out, again, Rashi here understands chilul, the claim of violating Shabbos, as really more of a bit of a passive, not fully celebrating it. Similar to the previous concerns, you won't have enough free time, you won't fully celebrate it. But clearly, Rav Yaakov Emden takes this Gemara extremely strongly. He takes the pshat of the Gemara, the pshat of the words of Lo Techalulunu, don't desecrate Shabbos. And Rav Yaakov Emden says, Nichshav Chilul Shabbos. It's literally considered an act of Chilul Shabbos, like malacha, like lighting a fire, like winnowing, the best word that only Jewish children know what it means to winnow, because why would anyone else know the word winnowing? But nonetheless, like these other malachot, so too, learning new Torah, learning difficult stuff on Shabbos would be considered Chilul Shabbos. So just to review before exploring this a little more, what we've seen now is really two broad categories of what the problem could be about teaching new material, learning new Torah on Shabbat. And those two broad categories have at least three options. So, category one possible explanation of this Gemara in Nedarim is that the reason we don't teach new material on Shabbos, the reason the schools are closed on Shabbos, is because we have a concern for pedagogical calculations. We think it won't be an effective way to teach. Students will be distracted, they won't be listening, and therefore, out of a concern for pedagogy, a concern for efficient teaching, we don't teach on Shabbos. That's the first answer. A din in Hilchos Talmud Torah. And that, we said, seems to be the position of the Rambam, who quotes this law in Hilchos Talmud Torah and not in Hilchos Shabbos. Very good. Now, our second option is that this isn't a din in Hilchos Talmud Torah. It's not about the pedagogy that's the problem, but it's about Shabbos itself. If we're teaching students, we're not properly celebrating Shabbos. This, we said, was perhaps the approach of the Torah, who cites Toreach Shabbos, some amount of distraction or detractment from Shabbos, as the reason why that's prohibited. So that's the second category. Now, within this second category, we said there's at least two ways to understand it. One is an instrumentalist understanding or a pragmatic understanding, that the reason why there's a problem in teaching students, it's not intrinsically wrong. Teaching students new material doesn't itself violate Shabbos. It's just that if you do that, there's only so much time in the day. Practically, there's only so many resources, so much time to allocate to various mitzvot. We won't have enough time to fulfill the mitzvah of Shabbos. And as we saw the Meiri and Tosfos say explicitly, you won't have enough time to have proper sudas on Shabbos. I guess this is a good source for mine and Shoshana's tradition of having very long meals. You need to have your very long meal. So you can't have a very long meal if you're busy teaching your students. So we have an instrumentalist or pragmatic concern within Hilchos Shabbos as our second explanation. What we just developed now is a potential third explanation, based on the psak of Yaakov Emden, based on the psak of the, we saw before, quoting the Tzepichas B'Dvash and Minchas Elazar, that what the problem isn't an instrumentalist problem. It's not that by learning Torah, I'm using time I should be using for something else. That prevents a pragmatic obstacle to my fulfillment of mitzvot. But rather, it's an intrinsic or fundamental problem that the act of learning new Torah materials, the act of engaging in difficult intellectual matters, even of Torah, is Chilul Shabbos, is a violation of the rest we are commanded to fulfill on Shabbos. A fascinating idea. So before I go on, I just want to make sure, does all that make sense? Are there any questions? Feel free to unmute, to chime in. Any questions? I'm going to take a drink to give everyone a second to think.
It just seems, I never heard this before. I remember in junior high studying complicated, we would have exams on Sunday sometimes, and on spending all of Shabbos afternoon studying Talmud, and really it was reviewing, but it was very difficult material. They would talk about stuff that wasn't like activities that were not, they would use the word Shabbos,
Of course.
like the spirit of Shabbos. Like reading the newspaper, just idle talk. That was not in the spirit of Shabbos. And swimming, swimming. There were some people who swam, but there were reasons luckily not to do it. But there was also the idea it was not in the spirit of Shabbos.
I completely
never
agree.
Talk about learning.
It's shocking to think that learning could itself be Chilul Shabbos, a violation of Shabbos. I think Rabbi Yaakov Emden's formulation that seems to say nichshav Chilul Shabbos, that it's almost as if like an actual malacha or actual Chilul Shabbos is even more shocking. And I think because of that, I think this is perhaps one of the more difficult explanations of the Gemara, a little bit more difficult of an approach. So I want to present one last option. And this one last option, I think, is a bit of a compromise, a little bit somewhere between the purely instrumentalist approach and this more intrinsic issue or difficulty. It's not that, by teaching students, you're not fulfilling your meals on Shabbos. You're not fulfilling some other random mitzvah that should be taking your time. But it's also not that teaching Torah is inherently, intrinsically a violation of Shabbos. Rather, I want to present the fourth position, third within the Dinei Shabbos, that of the Ran. And I think what the Ran is doing, or at least giving us the basis of, is presenting the option that it's not that teaching difficult Torah is inherently wrong, but it's inherently wrong to be doing that with your kids on Shabbos. That's not what you should be doing with your children, with your family on Shabbos. You want to learn? That's Oneg Shabbos for you. You enjoy it? For sure. But that's not the proper way to include your children and your family in the Shabbos celebration. So the Ran says as follows. The first answer in the Gemara, parents need free time for the mitzvah on Shabbos. She'abos hatinokos, pon on the mitzvah Shabbos. Like Rashi says, the parents need free times for the mitzvah Shabbos. And we saw before, Tosfos and the Meiri took this to mean Suda Shabbos, the meals. But what does the Ran say? Mishtashe'in imatinokos. They need to play with their children. Vim yikru atinokos lechatchila, and if the children are busy learning, yachushu levetulam, the parents will be too concerned about bittul Torah, about wasting their time, and they won't fulfill the mitzvah of Shabbos, which is playing with their children. In other words, the relationship you have with your child should not just be expressed through Talmud Torah, but Shabbos is an opportunity to express a relationship with your child to develop and cultivate a celebration of Shabbos, an oneg Shabbos, the mitzvah of celebrating Shabbos, based in shashua, in fun, and playing together, and bonding. And that it's not that you're not fulfilling your meals, you're not having a suda, but it's that you shouldn't be focusing on your children as little students, as receptors of knowledge. You should be focusing on them as your children, as kids who want to play with you, who want to get to know you, who want to build a relationship with you. Just to drive this home a little bit further, it's a little bit of a stretch, but not too far. The Gemara in Shabbos, in a totally different context, tells us the following observation by Abaye. Abaye ashkechele le Rabba. Abaye found Rabba. He was sliding his son off the back of a donkey. The Gemara doesn't say anything about it being Shabbos. We know from the broader context, actually, it is Shabbos. It's a question of whether or not you can ride animals on Shabbos. But what Rashi comments here is the Mishashev Lebreya Gavid Dechamra. He was sliding his kid off the back of the donkey. This Shabbos, on Shabbos. Why? L'shasheya hatinok. For the delight or for the fun of the child. So again, I think perhaps the Gemara is touching on some sort of idea here that there's some sort of inherent value. There's some sort of intrinsic value to using Shabbos as an opportunity to play with your kids, to bond with your kids as meaningful, substantive family time. And if you're using it as an opportunity to make sure you're getting your tuition dollars, to make sure they're learning, to make sure they're going over the materials, then you're missing out on the proper fulfillment of Oneg Shabbos, of using this as an opportunity for Shashui Tino, for playing with the child. Just to drive this home, the shocking idea a little more, I have here an unusual source for me. I quote a Zichron Meir, a Hasidic source, the third Blazhever Rebbe. I don't know where Blazhev is, apparently it's a place. But it's a very powerful piece by the Zichron Meir that I think really drives home this idea. The Zichron Meir, hi Mika, the Blazhever Rebbe here says, Game Shabbos, with regards to Shabbos, Hainu Taima de Ein Korim B'Tchila. The reason we don't teach students new material on Shabbos, Mishum de Yavnu Avasa de Yanuke, the Mitzvasa de Shabbos, is because the first reason that the parents need free time for Shabbos. Ubiran, and the Ran explains what's that mean? Sha'abos hatinokos ponim the mitzvah Shabbos, umishdasheyan em hatinokos. They need time to play with their children. And they won't do that if they have to teach new material. V'yesh lahayir. We should comment, we should make the point. The Gemara in Shabbos, Kuf Yatanam Bet, the Amar Rish Lakish, where Rish Lakish says, Mishum Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya, in the name of Rabbi Yehuda the Nasi, the Ein Vatlan Tinokos, Afilu Lebinyan Beis HaMikdash. We don't nullify, cancel, waste the Talmud Torah time. We don't commit Bittul Torah. We don't close the schools, even to build the Beis HaMikdash itself. If we have to raise a bunch of teenagers to go build the Beis HaMikdash, we need people to hew the stone, to place it. We don't stop the teenagers from learning. Better they sit in school and the Beis HaMikdash take an extra week, an extra month to be built. One of the most important mitzvot, and not just a mitzvah, but a fundamental societal shift, a recognition of an eschatological value. The building of the Beis HaMikdash does not trump Talmud Torah, does not trump teaching students. But when it comes to parents playing with their children, playing Monopoly with your kid, we don't play Monopoly, we're very into board games, so we're beyond that. Playing Azul or Ticket to Ride with your kid, that takes priority over building the Beis HaMikdash. Building the Beis HaMikdash, we don't cancel Talmud Torah, but we cancel Talmud Torah for the sake of playing with your kids on Shabbos. A shocking idea. So the Zichron Meir gives a few answers, but I want to just focus on the last one here. I think it's a very powerful answer. Says the Zichron Meir, the Od Efshar Lomar. You can say, Suda Shabbos, when it comes to the Suda, to the meal, to the celebration together of Shabbos, Yachol Av B'siyata Dishmaya, Lahashpia Lahayeladim Bezeh. The father has an immense opportunity to influence the child. Shemizmarim Shirot, V'tishpachos Lashem. You sing praise to God. You share Torah together. And we know from Pirkei Avos how important it is to share divrei Torah over a meal. And through this, the children will benefit. That their religiosity, their commitment, their awe and dedication to God is a higher priority even than the intellectual efforts of learning a sugya, of opening a Gemara. And through sitting at the Shabbos table, through having you, your parents, take the time to teach you, to go over Shabbos, to celebrate Shabbos, to have a special treat on Shabbos, to give you your grape juice and challah. We just spent Shabbos with our niece and nephew. She was very hyped to have challah and grape juice as a highlight of her Shabbos. But those moments, those little moments that you associate with your parents, with your family, of observing Shabbos together, that instills yira, that instills commitment, religiosity, values that extend beyond the intellectual realm, that can't just be taught from a book, that you can't just learn in a Gemara. Sha'al yadei zeh Torah sa mitkayemes. Through this, the Torah that they learn, the Sfarim they open, will be miskayim, will sustain, will persist. Their commitment to religion will continue. Like it says in Maseches Avos, like we see in the Gemara in Chulin, that when you have moments of family bonding, of meals, of getting together and collecting together, those are special opportunities to influence and to educate. That you can only incite, you can only move people when they're eating, v'shtia, and drinking. That's why when we're in person, we'll always have food at our shiurim. Over Zoom, I can't promise that. But we see that it's not just that learning Torah is a distraction from playing with your kids. Quite the opposite. It's the goal of learning Torah, as the goal of teaching your children is inducting them into the tradition, developing, cultivating commitment to God, to religion, to the tradition of their parents and their parents' parents, making them part of something bigger. Then you're missing the point by telling them to observe Shabbos less, to celebrate less, to sing one less zmirot at the Shabbos table, so that they can go and learn one more daf of Gemara. Quite the opposite. It's better that you spend that time playing a game with your kid, engaged in shashua tinok, sliding them off the back of the donkey like Rabbi did, playing with a dog with them. Though I guess there's muksa questions there. But engaging your child, playing with them one-on-one and developing your familial, your parental relationship with them, that itself is the greatest kiyum of Torah, the greatest kiyum of continuing on the tradition of Torah. The Nimsa, and it turns out the bitula shel Torah, that bittul Torah, that minimizing or nullifying a little bit of learning time, kanhu kiyuma. That is its fulfillment. That leads to its long-lasting persistence. That through making sure that Shabbos is properly used as an opportunity to inculcate Jewish values with the family, to bond and realize that part of Judaism is not just intellectual, but it's lived. It's a lived experience. That Judaism is my mom's challah, the food she would make, the conversation we had together over the Shabbos table. That is part of what your responsibility as a parent and as an educator is. And if you're neglecting that to teach another Mishnah, to teach another Gemara, then you're neglecting your responsibility. You're doing the wrong thing. Therefore, the Gemara comes and tells us it's prohibited to teach new material on Shabbos. Just to drive this home a little bit. I guess before we drive it home a little further, just to review, to bring it all together, we saw that the Gemara says you can't teach new material on Shabbat. The Gemara brought two answers to explain why you can't teach students new material on Shabbat. One, parents need time for Shabbos activities. Two, the kids won't be able to pay attention because they'll be weighed down by eating and drinking, etc. They'll be sluggish. So the latter approach we pointed out is very much a pragmatic concern about Talmud Torah, about effective pedagogy, effective teaching. You won't effectively teach if the kid's heart or spirit isn't there. And we saw that some people conflate both answers and make this entire sugya, this entire question one, about efficient education. Though we saw the other approach is to say this isn't a din in Talmud Torah. This isn't about how do you effectively teach, but quite the opposite. This is a din about Hilchot Shabbat. This is a din, a halacha, about how to properly observe the Sabbath. Within that approach, we saw one answer, an instrumentalist or a pragmatic concern, was that if you're learning new hard material, it'll take a lot of time. And if you take a lot of time, your kids won't have enough time to properly have a Suda. You'll run out of time and you'll end up only having 2 and not 3 meals over Shabbos. That was one approach. The second approach we saw was that it's not a pragmatic concern about the other mitzvot of Shabbat that you won't fulfill, but rather that somehow learning difficult material, teaching new material, engaging in something that causes to intellectual difficulty, to a real need for attention, that itself is a violation of Shabbos. That's nichshav kichel Shabbos, in the words of Rav Yaakov Emden, that you should be in resting, and something that's not restful, even if it's only intellectually strenuous, not physically strenuous, is chil Shabbos. That was the latter approach, and we saw that how shocking that idea could be, that learning Torah could be asur on Shabbos. Finally, we presented maybe perhaps more of a middle approach within that it's not instrumentalist purely. It's not that, oh, you're wasting time you should be using to fulfill your mitzvahs in Shabbos. And it's not that it's inherently usher to spend time learning a difficult sugya, but rather it's that you shouldn't be using your time with your children that way on Shabbos. You should be using your time with your children, l'shashua hatino, to play with them, to bond with them, to instill a relationship that's based in real personalities, real parents, and real experience, and not just in book learning. So just to drive home this last idea a little bit more, there's an interesting comment by Rav Hirsch that I think is really powerful, that we know that a few weeks ago in the parsha we read an interesting prohibition. The Torah tells us about the mitzvah of kibbud av v'em, or really more specifically yirat av v'em, the need to respect or have awe for one's parents, and the same breath, the same pasuk as the commandment to observe the Shabbos. Ish imo v'aviv tirau v'shaptatai tishmoru. You have to revere your mother and father and keep my Sabbath. And the famous question all the commentaries ask is, why are these two mitzvot grouped together in one pasuk? They have nothing to do with each other. Why is it so important to group them together? So Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch has an amazing idea. I think it's a beautiful, powerful idea that since I've seen it, it's the pshat to me. It's obviously the answer. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says the reason they're grouped together is because the way in which you fulfill yira, the way in which you instill awe for parents, and ultimately religious awe, religious commitment to your parents' tradition, to the tradition of your parents' parents, your grandparents, to the Masorah of Judaism, is through the Shabbos table, is through Shabbos. And what we see here is that God is giving us a hint that through inculcating family values, inculcating the opportunity to learn together over Shabbos, that will lead to yira, that will lead to awe, to respect, and ultimately respect for the tradition. So says Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, Kasher Yalad Yehudi Roa Es Horav Shomrim Et Shabbat. When a Jewish child sees his parents observing Shabbos, Yilamed Gam Hu Medugmat HaHorem. He'll learn from the examples of his parents. L'sit et olamo l'raglei Hashem. To raise his world up to the feet of Hashem, to strive for a greater religious fulfillment. In other words, says Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the greatest way to inculcate the values of Yira, the values of commitment to parents, to God, to tradition, and to religion, is around the Shabbos table. I think that really touches upon a similar idea what we're suggesting within the Ran, that Shabbos is a time dedicated not just to Torah, but to the Torah of family, the Torah of lived experience, the Torah of what Judaism means as not just an intellectual tradition, but as a lived religion. And that's accomplished with a family sitting around the table, sharing Shabbos together. So just to share a little bit about my mom, this was so true of my experience of Shabbos growing up. And even after I left, I went to college. Whenever I'd visit for Shabboses, it was just so characterized by my mom and the family experience of what it meant to gather together on Shabbos, to sit around a table and to share foods, to discuss things together, to develop a personal relationship and to root my religious experiences, my commitment to Judaism, to my parents, to living beings, to people who have a form and a figure, who have a personality, and who mean so much to me. So I remember growing up every Shabbos, every Friday night. My brother and sister are here listening. My brother and sister are 9 and 10 years older than me, or I shouldn't say their age, sorry guys, but they're much older than me. So when I was growing up, they were out of the house. They were in college, they were in grad school, and really it was me and my parents for a lot of my Shabboses when I was younger. I remember every Friday night, my mom would stay up late with me, and she would stay up late with me, and she would play Scrabble with me. She would save a bag of gummies, that'd be our Shabbos treat, and we'd play Scrabble 1, sometimes 2, sometimes even 3 times. She'd always make sure that I won, so it took more than one time until I won. We'd play a couple times. And one that just meant so much to me in terms of bonding. It meant so much to me in terms of having an opportunity to play as a kid who didn't have his older siblings around because they were off in school. But also, it was a great opportunity for me to spend time telling my mom about my week, bonding together, building the relationship that would really power through and persist even once I wasn't home every week. I wasn't home every Shabbos. And it also really instilled a love of language and a love of words in me that carry on to this day. I minored in comparative literature when I was in college. I love reading, and it all comes from my mom, from those opportunities of playing word games together, playing Scrabble together. Every Shabbos afternoon, we would get in the New York Times, and my mom would go straight for the New York Times book review. And we'd go through the book review together, and my mom would go through all the books she read already, which was most of them. She would assign us books, say, you'll like this, you would like that. My house to this day is just stacks and stacks of books from my mom, my dad, me, my siblings. That learning and book learning was so important. But again, it wasn't for the knowledge and the information it conveyed. It was a means for relationship building, for sharing things together, for bonding together. And that was something that just was learned over the Shabbos table. And of course, it goes without saying, the Shabbos songs, My mom would always ask me to sing Bilvavi Mishkan Evna. My brother would always sing B'Shem Hashem. She had certain songs she asked different ones of us to sing. We'd always sing Ishus Chayil to her at night. The food she would make, her challah, her kugels. This Shabbos, for those who are in town, I'm going to be hosting a kiddush featuring some of my mom's kugels, some of the food she would make. But that really characterized my Shabbos experience and really gave me the basis for everything that came after. The commitment to religion, the commitment to intellectualism, to Talmud Torah, to literature, to history. Everything that I learned, everything that interests me, the person I became was rooted in those Shabbos around the Shabbos table together. Taking the opportunity, playing with your kids, building and bonding together. So I hope that everybody learned a little bit about my mom. I'm really thankful for that opportunity. And we also learned a little bit about the beauty of Shabbos, that something, a value as high as Talmud Torah, as learning Torah, is in some ways secondary to the foundational building, the foundational teaching that can be done around the Shabbos table together. So thank you everybody for coming and joining me tonight. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to email, to text, to reach out. And thank you all for listening and learning a little bit about my mom, about my family, and about me. Have a good night, everybody. I'm going to head off to Sheva Brachos now.